Hi everyone, this is Jamie, and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. So, on today's episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about, we could say, myths or stories within yoga and Ashtanga yoga, and in particular, we could say some assumptions around yoga practice, and also, when we get given some information from teachers that are said in maybe quite a dogmatic way, as if these are facts, and why it's good to question these sometimes. And I'm going to give you some examples that I've done over the years, which have proven to be untrue, or, as I said, it's good to question these things, and I'll give you some examples of some of the things I've questioned in yoga and Ashtanga yoga and why it's good to do this. Sometimes, things just get really repeated. Sometimes when teachers say things, it becomes a little bit like really a mythology in a way. Sometimes things get repeated and we share information, and we could say maybe Instagram and places like that can perpetuate this a little bit, and we could say the culture of trying to gain a little bit of attention online can also perpetuate these things as if they are truths. And I'll give you some examples of this. Let's check out my notes here. So, something I came across quite early in my own yoga practice, actually, and something that was initially taught to me quite early on in my yoga practice and my Ashtanga yoga practice was this idea of pulling the navel in. Yeah, so in Ashtanga yoga, we will call this Uddiyana Bandha. So this is where we pull the lower abdominals in, and we're thinking of pulling our navel in towards our stomach muscles. So we think about this when we're doing almost like a forced exhalation where we contract the lower abdominal muscles. Now, this in itself is not incorrect. There's lots of uses for this within our yoga practice, and there's lots of uses for this in the Ashtanga yoga system, especially when you're learning, for example, to jump back and jump through, and where you're pressing and you're lifting and you're doing, we could say, you're doing more strength-based exercises where you're contracting the lower abdominal muscles and you're looking to kind of squeeze the body together. So using Uddiyana Bandha in this way is important, and it's an important part of yoga practice and the Ashtanga yoga system. What I've largely seen, though, is that there's an overuse of this where it's generally taught to keep this engaged throughout your yoga practice. I've actually heard a lot of Ashtanga teachers will tell you to pull the navel in pretty much in all postures or most postures as a way to engage the lower abdominal muscles. Now, I will say that's incorrect. Yeah, there's an overuse, there's an oversimplification of using the lower abdominal muscles in this way. And what I've seen in a lot of students, especially when I have visitors come and come to my shala, people who are traveling and that, or people that have practiced at other places and start practicing with us, is that their breathing really is not integrated properly. And I would also say that there's an overuse of these lower abdominal muscles. There's an overcontraction of the transverse abdominis, the lower abdominal muscles, to the point where it's actually inhibiting their yoga practice, and I would say is restricting their breathing. And also, what I've largely seen is that it has a negative effects on other postures, such as, back bending, for example. So when I first started doing Ashtanga and visiting different shalas, I was generally told to do this. It was like, pour the navel in. This was something that was just repeated. Yeah, it was one of these kind of statements. And also, if you go onto YouTube and Instagram and stuff, you'll see a lot of teachers repeat this statement as if almost like a mantra, to just, pour the navel in, pour the navel in. It's a little bit like another cue I'll go into later. around tucking the tailbone or relaxing the glutes. There's lots of these oversimplified statements that kind of are too simplified, because in reality, postural yoga and different movement practices, aren't that simple. It's usually much more complex, and most students need different input at different times. But when teachers are doing workshops, or they're teaching you these Kapotasana in 3 steps, or these oversimplified statements online to get attention, these become almost like religious statements that people just repeat. I'll go into that a little bit more later, but let's just stick with Uddiyana Bandha. So this is an oversimplification of how to use the lower abdominal muscles. There's lots of places, again, within your yoga practice and Ashtanga yoga where you will be using your lower abdominal muscles in this way, but there's lots of times when you won't. And actually, as I've said, when I meet a lot of practitioners, they are over-contracting these muscles, To breathe comfortably and to breathe in a relaxed way, you need to let your belly be relaxed and loose, I think I went into this a little bit on the Bandha podcast, and how culturally growing up, I experienced this in the UK. A lot of people will pull their stomach in, when they're wearing a t-shirt or clothing, because they want their waist to look slim. And I remember growing up as a young man that this was something I thought about, and I think most people do, where there's this pulling in of the navel to, look slimmer in clothing. And I quite consciously remember actively dropping that. That was something I was very conscious of when I learned how to backbend correctly, actually, where I challenged this dogmatic kind of statement of pulling the navel in, and actually learned how to backbend correctly with a different teacher. And this changed my breathing practices, it changed my meditation practice, and it also changed, really how I was moving in the Ashtanga yoga system, where I was aware that I was generally over-contracting my lower abdominal muscles. And I think this was really because I was really just overly prescribed the contraction of Uddiyana Bandha. And I think it's just that some teachers, for good or bad reasons, tend to just repeat statements. They just tend to repeat parrot-like statements, and these things get oversimplified, and in a dogmatic way they get told this. And this was my experience of early on practicing with different Ashtanga teachers, was this oversimplification of pulling the navel in, which really was just creating too much tension in my low belly, was inhibiting my ability to breathe diaphragmatically. And also in my meditation practices and things like this, where, again, this oversimplification and use of different body movements can have a negative effect because it's too simplified. Maybe these things get repeated because people don't really understand technically how to move in different ways, but mostly I think it's because, as I've talked about in previous episodes, there's a dogmatism in Ashtanga yoga where certain phrases and certain words get used very unconsciously. We have to be careful of the certain types of words that we use and the statements that we make. Words have a lot of power. Phrases and words have a lot of power and meaning to different people, especially when they're repeated. So we have to be a little bit conscious of the things we say. And in reality, working with different people over the years, there really is never an oversimplification of a way of teaching someone. In reality, of working with people over time is that they will need different input at different times of their practice, and they will need to be taught how to do different things at different times. When their body becomes more mobile and their strength builds, they will need different cues to activate and learn how to use different muscle groups. What I've experienced mostly is just this dogmatic way of using language in that way. Like this is a really good example, this pull the navel in. When are we pulling the navel in? How are we pulling the navel in? If you start to question your teacher and you start to question, why we do this, when we should do this, you shouldn't get a dogmatic, all of the time answer, or a very kind of simplified answer, because in reality, it's more complex. And to me, that's a bit of a red flag. As a student, looking for a teacher is an overly simplified way of doing something. It's much more nuanced and it's much more complex. And again, when I kind of challenged this with teachers and I started to experiment a lot myself, I really realized that, I was adding way too much tension into my breathing pattern. And the focus was just way too much on this contraction of the lower abdominal muscles. My theory behind this is that, maybe practicing with Pattabhi Jois back in the day, or some of the earlier teachers in India, probably because of a language barrier, there was an oversimplification of language because it was easier to say things in a simpler way. And probably because of the language difference, these things just become, very simplified as a way to teach students. But in reality, it's much more nuanced. So I think it's good to drop these concrete statements that don't really make sense in reality and shouldn't be used all of the time. So if you're pulling your navel in like that, again, think about when and how you are doing this. One of the reasons I'm bringing this up in this podcast is because when I meet lots of practitioners who come and visit our shala, most of them don't know how to breathe properly. It's something I've observed, especially in the last couple of years, is practitioners' inability to actually breathe fully and diaphragmatically. And when you think about yoga and its intention and design, it's mostly a breathing system. The asanas, the stretching, the strength work, obviously this is all part of that. But mostly what I focus on, and really this is a lot to do with what I also focus on as a teacher, is, how are we breathing? How well are we breathing? How much are we using our diaphragm when we breathe? How are we relaxing the right muscles at the right time? Or are we over contracting muscles and making everything kind of stiffer and, more anxious in a way? There's a relaxation that happens in the body from relaxing your belly when you breathe. How do you breathe in a back bend? I go into this in my workshops, some of my online material. It's really important that you learn how to breathe fully when you're back bending for safety reasons, but also for the fact that your nervous system, your body will relax in different postures when you learn how to breathe fully with your diaphragm to the point where your lower belly actually relaxes at some point. This is too technical to get into on this podcast, which is why I do workshops just on back bending and things like that, because it is quite complex. And it's nuanced. Different students will need different input at different times, which is why we should move away a little bit from these dogmatic statements like pull the navel in, where, like I say, practicing with people before, and you hear teachers say this online as if this is like a default setting and should be applied all the time. And in reality, this is not the case. And like I say, when I meet lots of practitioners who come and visit, there's an over contraction of these muscles and it's inhibiting their breathing pattern. And I would say when you're inhibiting your breathing pattern, you're restricting your ability to practice yoga fully. And again, this is going to add more tension and anxiety to your body, where you're not able to breathe fully diaphragmatically. This is an important one to say, but I think sometimes these statements get said because actually I'll go into that a little bit later. I'm going to save that for a little bit later. Let's go over a few other myths or assumptions I've heard over the years. Definitely pulling the navel in is a big one, and again, it should be used specifically in certain areas, more so in compression, contraction, lifting, pressing, arm balances, things like this. One I hear a lot, someone reminded me this the other day, is to relax the glutes in back bends. Now, I have a bit of a theory where this came from, and this is a big one I've heard over the years, is telling students to relax their glutes in back bends. Now, let's just get a little bit like anatomical on this for a moment. The glute max, the big muscle at the back of the bum, its primary function is to extend the hip, so to push the hip forward. Yeah, so you'll notice this when you do anything explosive like a box jump or something like that, or running. Yeah, where you're using your hamstrings, the posterior muscles, to propel you forward. Yeah, you're using your glutes, your hamstrings to push you forward. Now, an oversimplification would be to say to relax your glutes in all back bends. You could also say an oversimplification would be to contract your glutes in all back bends. Some teachers tend to do, again, these kind of blanket statements, like relax your glutes in back bends or squeeze your glutes in back bends. The reality is, it's complex. Yeah? Some students will feel less compression in their lumbar area, especially in the sacrum, if they relax their glutes. Some students will feel less pressure in their low back when they engage and contract the glutes. Now, my experience of this, like most things in life, it's usually somewhere in the middle. Yeah, it's somewhere in between. If you're contracting the upper half of your glutes, so the glute minimus, the medius, the ones around the upper region of the bum, this will definitely add some tension to your low back. Yeah, my experience of experimenting with this a lot is that if you overly clench your glutes, especially the ones that are on the upper half of the bum, this can lead to some added tension in the lumbar region. But if you learn how to train to use the lower half of your glutes, so basically the teardrop, the main part of your glute, the bum, this will actually help extend your hip, and for most practitioners, in my experience, will actually relieve pressure in their low back. And if you think about it from an anatomical perspective, your glute max is one of the biggest muscles in the body, but it's also the main muscle for extending the hip. So if you're training yourself to not use your glute max in a back bend, it's kind of like training yourself to not use your quads in a squat. You can do it, it's just probably not the most efficient thing to do. So my experience of I've met a lot of students actually who don't use their glutes at all in a back bend. And I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just from an anatomical perspective, it's not the most efficient thing to do. My experience of witnessing this is because of dogmatic statements. Yeah. Someone probably found a lot of benefit from relaxing their bum in a back bend. And then, sometimes when someone's quite charismatic or they say something in a very confident way, this can ripple effect, like this can just really spread quite quickly within communities where this is like the said thing to do. Oh, this guy is very confident in what he says and he believes that that's the right way to do it. And it kind of spreads quite quickly, and these statements can become almost concrete as if they are facts. And in reality, again, it's much more complex and much more nuanced. And, I can say this without sounding too, how can I word this? Something I've observed in Ashtanga practitioners, largely, is an underdeveloped glute max. Yeah, if we're just going to look at this on an external kind of view. I was talking to some Vinyasa practitioners some years ago, and someone mentioned that they noticed that a lot of Ashtanga practitioners had very flat bums. And we were just joking about this, how different practices cultivate different things. And I was like, yeah, that's something I've noticed too. And it kind of reinforced what I felt actually, that there was this tendency within Ashtanga for practitioners to inhibit the use of their glute max. Now, it doesn't mean that it's wrong in the sense that doing that will enable you to do Kapotasana or other back bends and stuff like that. It's just that potentially you're training yourself to do a movement by inhibiting the largest muscle that will help you do that movement. And I think really it's because it's a very simplified cue. don't use your glute, use your glute. But actually, to teach someone how to use their glutes properly in a back bend is more complex, and it requires a little bit more skill as a practitioner, and also as a teacher, really, to teach someone how to use their glutes in a back bend, because it requires more focus. Yeah. And again, if you're training yourself to do back bends with a completely relaxed glute max, I would say that you're training your body to do a movement in a less optimal way. You're inhibiting the main muscle to do so. And this isn't the case in other yoga styles. Yeah, this is the conversation I had with Vinyasa practitioners, is you don't see that in other yoga styles. And I don't think it's because of the Ashtanga yoga system. I think it's because sometimes dogmatic quotes spread. There isn't a dogmatic way of teaching Vinyasa yoga where someone has said you need to relax your glutes in all back bends. That's why you don't really see that in other styles of yoga. But in Ashtanga yoga, it has some dogmatism in its nature, as I've spoke about on this podcast. And, again, statements can spread quite quickly. And I think this glute one is a very common one. I remember being at different shalas over the years, and this question would come up quite often. Someone would say, someone told me I shouldn't use my glutes, and I've heard teachers laugh about that, and I've heard some other teachers go, yes, 100%, don't ever use your glutes in back bends. And it shows you the kind of dogmatic nature sometimes of teaching, but also of the Ashtanga yoga system or community, you could say, where things get kind of spoken about as like gospel, as if these are hard facts. And like I say, in reality, if you question it and you go into the details of it a little bit more, you will really notice this. And this is a good example. Yeah, you want a nice, strong, healthy glute max. It's a big muscle. It's great to use it. Yeah. You want to use that muscle to push your hip forward. You just have to train it properly. If you experience pain when you engage your glute max in the back bend, then obviously back off. Again, it's more nuanced. But in my experience of practicing and teaching, it's more optimal for your body to train the correct muscles that accentuate that movement. And if you're trying to extend your hip, you're inhibiting the largest muscle by doing that. Yeah. If you're training yourself not to use your glute max, you're training yourself to inhibit the largest muscle you have to extend your hip. You can use your hamstrings. You can use your quads and things like that. But in my experience, it's worth pursuing learning how to use your glute max in a back bend where you're not over contracting to the point where you're creating tension in your low back. It requires a little bit more discipline, and it requires, again, a little bit more focus in your practice. But again, be careful of dogmatic statements. I would say this is definitely one. And like I say, the observation of people's bodies in Ashtanga generally is practitioners with a very underdeveloped, or you could say inactive, glute max. Yeah, to me, this is incorrect in a way, if you think about it from trying to utilize the body. If you want to do a pull-up and a chin-up, that's like asking me to do that without using my lats. You want to use the biggest muscles. One of the reasons we can get fatigued and tired in yoga and Ashtanga yoga is when we're not using the right muscle to do the movement, as in the biggest one. You want to use the biggest muscles that are designed to do that movement so that you get less fatigued. Yeah. So ultimately, to be more efficient in your yoga practice, the big muscles, use the big muscles to do those jobs so that you're not overusing and relying on using the smaller muscles. This is sort of basic physiology or sports science, really. Let's check a few before I go into sort of the origins of this a little bit. But handstands is another one, yeah? I've been told for years by different teachers not to do handstands. It was like another kind of dogmatic thing that handstands will have a negative effect on your yoga practice. I challenged this because it's in my nature to challenge it. And also I wanted to learn handstands. I thought this is a fun movement. And, listening to interviews and talks with a lot of the old school practitioners that were going to Mysore back in the day, handstands was a very normal thing. It was a very normal movement that people did. And I wanted to learn this, so I did. And I had a lot of negative feedback from teachers to how this was going to negatively affect my practice. It's showing off. What other statements did I get? Yeah, it's going to make my shoulders super stiff and things like this. And, I'm going to break this down for you a little bit on my experience of this and where I think this comes from. Let's just check in with the stiffness thing. If you're doing like multiple solo handstand sessions a week, for hours at a time, you're going to get stiffer in your shoulders and your upper back. That's kind of default. But it's also like saying, doing an excessive amount of running during your week is also going to make your hips a bit stiffer. This is also true. Yeah, these are kind of common sense, you could say. My experience of adding handstands into my Ashtanga practice has been great. Yeah, it's so good for so many different things. It's just someone some time ago said that handstands were bad, and again, this spread like wildfires. To me, this is another one of these dogmatic statements that actually, if you challenge, doesn't really add up and doesn't really make sense. If you're an intermediate series practitioner, for example, and you're working on back bends and Kapotasana and things like that, if you're doing an excessive amount of solo handstand sessions outside of your practice, this could have a negative effect where you stiffen your shoulders. But adding handstands into your actual Ashtanga practice, to me, didn't really make much difference. Yeah, handstands in your in Surya Namaskar A and B, adding these to the transitions in primary series, and also tuck handstands and things like that into Bakasana B, places like this, to me has been super beneficial for my practice and also for my students. Yeah. It teaches you so much about balance, how to control your movement with your fingers. And if you're interested in my philosophy on Bandha, this is very much related to this. So go and check out my video, my podcast on Bandha. It's an excellent movement, yeah? It gives you confidence, it's fun, and it really adds some sort of explosiveness and some playfulness into the transitions in primary series and intermediate, and it also really prepares you for some of the arm balances that come later. So for me, there's not really any negatives to adding handstands into the practice, and I would also say it really benefits women a lot. Yeah, a lot of female practitioners I meet who struggle with the jump back and other things like Pincha Mayurasana and things like this. Adding handstands into primary series and working with the balance into tuck handstands and pressing from Utkatasana, for example, and Virabhadrasana, those transitions in primary series. This is excellent, yeah? It really gives people confidence, it's fun, it builds some strength and stability in the shoulder joints. To me, it's been really, I would say, beneficial giving this to my students and making this a normal movement. Yeah, this idea that it can create some sort of arrogance or people showing off in the shala. I think that can be true. I've been to some shalas where that's going on. There is like a competitive vibe in the shala where people are showing off. But that goes with all postures. It's not just handstands. I've seen that where people do this, putting their leg behind their head or catching their ankles or something like that in a back bend. You can show off, in Ashtanga, you could show off in lots of different postures if that's like the one that you're very good at. In my room, for example, handstands are a normal movement. Yeah, it's not been built up into a thing where some people show off. It's just a normal movement. Yeah, Pincha Mayurasana is basically an arm balance. Karandavasana, you could show off doing Karandavasana. You could show off doing Scorpion. There's lots of postures you can show off in. Kapotasana, you could be like that. You could have that energy in your practice, but you can normally tell when a practitioner has that kind of energy And you can always tell when a teacher and a shala has that kind of energy. I would say in my shala, it's not like that. It's just a normal movement. It's just being taught that way to not become a thing, because there's so many benefits to it. And actually, if you think about the Ashtanga system, it's actually one of the easier movements to learn. Like leg behind the head, Karandavasana, Kapotasana. These are complex movements that take, for most people, many years to learn. Handstands is not. It's quite a simple movement in a way. It doesn't require that much mobility or strength, and it has so many benefits. It really does open the shoulder for lots of people at some level, and then that balances out when you get more into the back bending. So for me, this is another dogmatic statement that just got passed around, and I think this largely came from Sharath in Mysore. I'm not really sure why he didn't like handstands. Maybe he wasn't very good at it himself. I'm not really sure. But to be honest, it's a normal movement. I really like the fact that the older practitioners played with this a lot. It's kind of fun. And if you think about the culture from Sharath and Mysore, he had a lot of focus on leg behind the head and catching heels in back bends. Probably because he was very good at those. And, most teachers tend to emphasize the things that they like and that they're good at. And I think that's generally the case in this instance, is that if you are really good at catching your heels in a back bend, maybe you'll emphasize that in your teaching style. Personally, I like arm balances. I like there's a lot of fun and there's a lot of benefit from learning those. So from my teaching style, I will emphasize that a bit, but I'm also aware of balancing that out. And I think good teachers will tend to do that. They'll be aware of the things that they like, and they'll also be aware of the things that are challenging for them, and they'll be able to see their students and kind of see what will balance them out. Because ultimately, in our yoga practices, we're trying to balance different energies. Handstands, arm balances, strength training has a certain type of energy. Back bends, the deep openings have a different type of energy. So we're always trying to balance those out. So, it's something to be aware of as teachers. Even though we have our favorite kind of stuff we like, we're always trying to balance those energies out. And you should feel that from your teacher, that they're not trying to overemphasize the things that they like. They're actually trying to give you a good balance within your Ashtanga practice. So if you're someone who's more on the hypermobile, flexible side, for example, working more on strength work is going to balance out your body for sure. If you're someone who's more on the stiffer, stronger side, your teacher's probably going to emphasize more opening and more stretching in that way. So these aren't to be said as dogmatic statements. It's interesting to think about how these things become, they spread like this. I've been to shalas where, someone will shout across the room because you momentarily went into a handstand, and it's just, where does it come from? It's just this kind of dogmatic kind of statements of like why things are bad. Challenge that. Well, why wouldn't you be able to do handstand? What's the negative sides to it? And there aren't really that many. If you challenge it and you question it, there's lots of benefits to practitioners working on handstands. I just touched on that actually. Catching heels in back bends. This isn't really a dogmatic statement, but this is more about where certain teachers put emphasis. We talked about showing off. I've seen lots of people show off catching their heels in back bends. This is, if you think about, if you go online, for example, on Instagram and stuff, the thing to show off with, if you're practicing in Mysore with Sharath or had been, would be to show a video of yourself catching your heels in a back bend. That seems to be this kind of hallmark rubber stamp of a practitioner. And in my experience, most people shouldn't actually do that. If I look at most practitioners and their bodies, it doesn't mean you can't or you shouldn't try, but just purely from a physicality and anatomical thing, I don't really think it adds a lot of benefit to most practitioners. And I don't think it's something we should even really strive to do. I'm not saying it isn't beneficial, and I'm not saying it's not interesting to try to do that. It's just that looking at different body types and looking at the way people move, I would say a large proportion of students should not try to catch their ankles in backbends. And the reason I say it is because I've seen some absolutely awful examples of people trying to catch their heels where they are nowhere near ready to even try to do that. Yeah. I'm not sure where this emphasis came from to push people into doing that. I'm guessing this came from Sharat because he was good at doing this. But I've seen countless examples and also countless videos, some that have been sent to me as well, of people who really have no idea about the body. And I'm being straight, like if you're trying, some of the examples I've seen of this, people trying to catch their ankles in a back bend, that teacher has really no idea about anatomy, breathing, or seeing someone's ability to do some movements. Yeah, it's a bit sad, really, that there's a kind of an energy of trying to show off with that, or to prove to someone that you can do something, or to get some kind of credibility. It seems to have become some kind of rubber stamp for practitioners in some way, that they can catch their heels in the back bend. And to be honest, I would question that. Yeah, especially I would question that and ask that person how was their back the next day or even the next week. Yeah, it might look good on Instagram for a shot, but I'm curious about someone's back the next day long term and how that is consistently. And like I say, I was observing different rooms and different body types. I would say a lot of people shouldn't even try to do that. You're not really going to get any spiritual benefit from doing this. It's an interesting thing to play with. And for sure, there are practitioners where I would say they can comfortably work towards that. But what I've seen largely is people being driven and forced and pushed, I would say, into trying to do that. When, even looking across a room, you can just clearly see that person's body is nowhere near ready to do that, or maybe never. Yeah, I think it would be good to drop this idea that this is some sort of thing that is necessary to attain in the Ashtanga yoga system. Yeah, it's a very advanced posture that a lot of people, I would say, are not really ready to do. It's an interesting thing that's become, or had become, a thing that people should aim for. And I would say that for some practitioners, again, that could happen, but largely, I would say most people are not ready for that, or even shouldn't even try. It's a very deep movement, yeah. Something I've touched on a little bit before is just the postures that are given to people, yeah. I talked about this more on the previous podcast around traditions in Ashtanga yoga, but if you think about how Ashtanga or yoga was taught previously with Krishnamacharya or even Pattabhi Jois back in the day, not all students did all postures. And there's a reason for this, yeah. I've talked about this before on square pegs through round holes. Not every student will do every posture, yeah. It doesn't mean you can't try it or you can't work on things, but some people shouldn't do some postures, just purely from a safety perspective mostly. And it's all right, yeah. It doesn't mean you're not an Ashtanga yoga practitioner if you don't do leg behind the head postures. It doesn't mean you're not an Ashtanga yoga practitioner if you don't do Kapotasana. It doesn't mean you're an Ashtanga practitioner if you might not ever do Marichyasana D or Supta Kamasana. In reality, it doesn't matter, yeah. Again, what's the intention, what's the goal with these practices is to heal people, is to open people up, provide a safe, good energy room for people to work through what I think is a well-intentioned system. As I said before, it just became dogmatic and institutionalized over the years. As I've said, bring back the research in Ashtanga yoga, pragmatism over dogmatism. It's okay that all students don't do everything, and holding people in half primary for 10 years is not beneficial either. Yeah, it's just dogmatism. And again, this is going back to the intention of this podcast is to, these myths, these kind of statements that get thrown around as if they're factual truths, when in reality it's just one person's idea of something. It doesn't mean it's correct for everyone. You need to challenge these statements, and again, be wary of very charismatic teachers who come out with dogmatic statements as if they are fact without the ability to question them. And if you do question them, you should get a very calm and nuanced answer, not a dogmatic one where you're told not to question things. Again, this is a red flag. Yeah. Now, where do a lot of these come from? We live in a culture now where from a sales perspective, it looks good if you come out with very bullet point statements. Kapotasana in 3 steps. Leg behind the head in 4 steps. These are very Instagrammy, sales-focused ways to grab your attention. And in reality, these don't really work. It's interesting to see someone do something in 3 steps or to give you a few pointers and cues. Mostly what I see with teachers doing this online is very dogmatic, and in reality, the reason I'm saying this, it can lead people down the wrong path. If someone this is what I mean with words being powerful, yeah? If someone gets this idea that they have to relax their glutes in back bend, or they have to do this certain thing in Kapotasana, that seed might stay there for many years. Yeah, and they might just be doing something that is very incorrect with their body for years. And this is something I've witnessed. Unfortunately, again, when you have a charismatic teacher who sounds very confident in what they say, and they come out with a very dogmatic statement, some students will take that as gospel, and it plants a seed that stays there for some time. Yeah. In reality, again, it's very nuanced. Yeah. When you're working with someone individually in a real world basis and you're seeing their bodies, these blanket statements aren't true. Yeah. Again, we have to be a little bit careful of language we use and things we say, because they have a lot of power. It might be good on Instagram to get some attention to say, do this in 3 steps. And that can be a bit fun, and we might pick up a few little pointers that might put us on the right path. But largely, in reality, can you do Kapotasana in 3 steps? No. The reality is requires a deep dive. Yeah, Kapotasana requires a deep dive, not Kapotasana in 3 steps. And it's just the way things are a little bit. Everything's short attention span. Everything's trying to grab your attention. And great, I can do this in 3 steps. It's like, no, you can't. It's a complicated movement. Lots of these movements are complicated and nuanced. And really, it's a reductionist way of teaching. And in a way, it's sort of devaluing teaching skills in a way. Yeah, it's like, it's cool to do these posts and, little tutorials and stuff. But really, these movements, many of us, have spent years working on and developing, and years teaching different ways of teaching this to different people, because everyone requires different input. All students need different things. Their bodies are all different. It's complex. They require different inputs at different times. And I'm saying this to students out there, just be a little bit careful with the information you take on board. And with these kind of dogmatic statements, yeah, try not to let that become a fixed idea in your head that someone else has it all figured out, and because they say it in a confident way that this must be true. It's good to challenge these things and experiment a lot. And my experience with teachers who say things like this in a dogmatic way don't really know body movement that well, if I'm being straight, because it's just repeating statements, yeah. Be careful of people that just repeat statements. You really want to work with someone who is well versed in different body movements, but also understands both sides of the coin. Yeah, I've met a lot of teachers over the years who just repeat statements, which is why I'm doing this podcast. And you ask them why, and you say, well, what is the reasoning behind that? And they don't really have one. And it's because it's just a repetition of phrases that become popular. We have to be a little bit careful of listening to advice like this, yeah? One other thing I think might be good to touch on this, I've got a few mixed feelings about it actually. I've seen a lot of teachers will tell you not to get massage, yeah? Or see physios and chiropractors and things like that. And I'll give my view on this. personally, I think massage is great. Yeah, you know, I'm very careful about who I let touch my body. I've had some really bad massages, and if I'm honest, most of them are not that great. But I've found a few people that are really good, and if you get a really good one, I think that has some benefit to the body, especially if you're someone who's used to being strong and in control all the time. Just being soft and receiving a massage can be really nice. But I really do understand, actually. This is one of the things I think I understand why teachers advocate not getting massage or seeing physios and chiropractors. And I'll tell you why. If you're practicing Ashtanga yoga a lot, I mean, consistently, maybe you're a 6 day a week practitioner or 4 or 5, your body will change a lot. Yeah, it changes a lot, and it's changing all the time. I've talked about this on many different episodes before. That input you get from the asana, you have to allow that to unfold. Yeah, and it has its ups and downs. This is one of the hardest things about teaching the system, is trying not to get students to think that there's something wrong with their body. Changing your body, changing to Kapotasana, Mauritiasana, you know, the changes that go on in the body are very deep, and that process can be uncomfortable. And usually when we feel some pain or discomfort, we want to fix it. That's the kind of reaction we have. So we want to go and see a specialist or someone who knows this or that, and we want it to be fixed. In reality, there's much more benefit from sitting back, waiting and observing and seeing what happens. The Ashtanga system does a deep structural change of the body over time. And the reason teachers will tell you not to go and see a physio or a chiropractor or even get a massage is because that can also have a negative effect on the changes that you're making. Let's say you're working on some type of hip opener, it doesn't really matter what it is, and you feel some tension change in your hip, and that might result in a sensation of discomfort or even pain. My experience of practicing the system over the years is it's much more beneficial to sit and observe those changes and continue with consistent yoga practice. This can be the same with getting sick, nausea, lots of different feelings and sensations, even emotional, which I might go into on another podcast actually, can definitely come up through a consistent Ashtanga yoga practice. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's more beneficial to sit back and observe those changes and observe the changes that happen from the structural change of Ashtanga yoga. If you go and see a physio or a chiropractor and they give you some adjustment, that will change that effect. It also doesn't mean that's wrong. Sometimes that's needed. There are sometimes you might need a click or a crack or some other input, but in my experience, most of the time, not. This is not saying there's a right and a wrong way. It's that over years of doing this, you will build up a deep trust in yourself, your intuition, and your own sensory idea of what's going on in your body, and you will stop looking for external resources on how to alleviate discomfort or pain in your body. It's a very liberating and empowering feeling, knowing that you can heal and fix your body yourself through consistent yoga practice. To me, this is a life changer. Yeah, it will totally change your relationship to your body and how you view health. Yeah, I'm not saying there aren't good physios, chiropractors, osteopaths, and obviously massage. There's lots of great, wonderful body workers out there. But what you learn from practicing Ashtanga yoga is to really observe those changes yourself. And if you're patient, and it requires a lot of patience, you will see that those structural changes have much more benefit when you don't go and get external therapy. That's been my experience of working with the Ashtanga yoga system, and I think a lot of teachers are aware of that, which is why they will generally advocate not to have any massage or seek external therapy, because some things that come up in your yoga practice that have the most positive change initially won't feel very nice. Yeah. The things that can be more transformative initially won't feel very good. But if you're patient enough and you observe, you will see that it will generally lead to a deeper structural change that has more benefit on your whole system, rather than getting secondary input from another healthcare worker. Now, I know lots of yoga practitioners that will disagree with that, and I will also say that they get a lot of benefit from seeking external therapy from different body workers. It's up for you to experiment. It's not right, it's not wrong. We probably just have different experiences of the system. But that's why teachers will say that, it will come down to that. So this can be, I wouldn't say this is a myth. It's more just like a personal experience of the system, and different teachers have had different experiences. But again, you need to find the one that works for you. Don't let a teacher dogmatically tell you, you have to do it like this, you have to do it like that. It's just that, for a lot of us, we've seen the benefit of being patient and observing those changes without doing any other input. I would say Ashtanga Yoga is more than enough physical therapy and body work that you'll ever need. It's a lot. To think that we need more is to me, it's a bit much. We do a lot of body work. It's more than enough in my experience. I think really that's covered some of the main ones. I mean, the breathing one is a big one as well. It's interesting to do all this asana work, but really think about that, your tension in your breathing, where you're holding tension. Again, these statements can set you back in a way, Again, be careful of teachers that come out with very strict dogmatic statements. If you question them, they should be able to give you a very balanced, nuanced answer. My experience of questioning teachers that come out with dogmatic statements, I've usually been met with anger or shutting the conversation down. This is a red flag, If you experience that, I would say you might be better off finding somewhere else to practice, or, you have to think about it. Why would someone tell you a dogmatic statement without really giving you a good reason why? I've talked about this in a lot of other episodes. There's reasons the teachers do this, but I think mostly it's just a cultural thing of repetition of statements, and it becomes popular. A statement becomes popular, and then everyone starts using it as if it's gospel, and it's not the most intelligent way to spread information, in my opinion. But I think that's enough, really. I've covered most of those. I guess the last thing would just be maybe morning practice. Teachers telling you have to practice in the morning. My shala's open in the morning. I think it's a great way to start your day. I like that. If you can and you get up and you move your body, it's a really nice way to start the day. Talked about it on previous episodes. Practicing in the afternoon is very different, especially if you've had a full day of work and you've got family responsibilities. For a lot of people, it's not even possible. You get home from work and, you've got kids, you've got other responsibilities and stuff. So morning practice is nice. If you can get into it, it's a great way to start the day. Like I say, if I had a choice, I'd get up, have a coffee and go straight to the shala. Boom, day begins. And again, like I said before, if you struggle with depression and things like that, it's a game changer. I've talked about it enough, I think, on previous episodes, but yeah, just question. This was a little bit more of a follow-up from the tradition one, but question dogmatism. Yeah, these myths, these statements. There is a culture in Ashtanga for this, where a lot of blanket statements, a lot of you have to do it like this, a lot of very one-dimensional thinking doesn't really benefit a lot of people. In my experience, question these things, and find a bit more of your own personal way of practicing this a little bit, without this top-down authoritative vibe.